What's up guys, Neil Swanson here and welcome back to High Gain Guitar Academy. Today we are going to talk about taming the distortion beast. And that's just a cool way of saying, we're going to learn how to play with distortion and not let all that extra noise make our playing sound sloppy, okay? So it just sounded more metal to say taming the distortion beast. Anyway, the first thing I'm going to tell you is probably the thing I see most guitar players do is most guitar players go right to their amp or their distortion pedal and they turn the gain, the level of distortion, they turn it all the way up to 10. They just max it out because we feel like to be the heaviest or have it be the most aggressive or raw or whatever it is you're looking for, that it has to be all the way up. Not the case, especially if you're looking to play things that are a little bit more articulate. If you're playing fast solos with a lot of notes, more distortion will definitely give you more sustain. The notes will hold out longer and it gives you a little bit more like upfront attack, but it also clutters the notes together. So what I'm saying is if you cut down on the amount of gain just a little bit, your notes will sound more articulate, have a little more clarity. Each note will have its own personality. Now, how do I achieve that clarity? Well, one is, like I said, maybe bring the gain down a little bit. Now listen, you could hear that I'm still using a lot of gain, but is the gain all the way up? Absolutely not. It's like maybe like 3/4 of the way. So it's still a lot of gain, but it doesn't need to be on 11, right? The next thing is the palm mute. I think it's really important to note that when you're playing with a lot of distortion, the muting of the side of your hand is really going to control all those strings you're not trying to play from ringing out. If I lay my hand across like I'm doing a palm mute, you could tell while I'm playing, it's cleaner, and then when I stop, it's still cleaner, right? Now, there's always gonna be some buzz and things like that. That's totally normal, when you're playing with a lot of extra distortion. I mean, the word distortion implies that there's gonna be noise, right? So anyway, so that palm muting technique, that really helps control the noise from the strings above the string you're playing, right? But what do you do with the strings below? Well, here's what I typically do for that. As I'm picking, which most of the time I'm holding my pick with my pointer and middle finger, sometimes with my middle for a little support, but that ring and pinky finger, sometimes I will grab the string underneath the one I'm playing and hold it still so that one's not ringing out. So check this out. I'm gonna play the B string and you're gonna see my ring or pinky hold the little E string still so you're not getting any extra noise from it. See how the pinky is just kind of holding that string still? That's an example of how I might control the strings using my picking hand, right? To kind of control that extra noise. It's also obviously useful for rhythm stuff. I just went to leads because when we're talking about playing a lot of notes, that's where I do all my noodling a lot of the time. But it applies to rhythm stuff too. Check it out. Especially when you're doing like that passage where I'm coming on and off of the palm muting, it's a good example of controlling the beast, right? Like sometimes I want the tight palm mute, sometimes I want to come off the strings and have them ring out. So getting used to coming on and off of the strings like that really helps to control the distortion beast, right? To tame the beast. Now I know a lot of you guys are thinking, what about noise gates? Like a noise gate pedal, okay? And if you don't know what that is, it's an effect that you can use to stop all the extra noise at a certain level. You can adjust the threshold, they call it, right? So noise gates are great, and I think always having, when you're playing with distortion, always having a bit of noise gate on is always a good idea, but some people like to set the noise gate all the way to 10, again, the extreme setting, and that's really good for when you need a really sharp stop like this. Right? No noise. The drawback of that is when you go to play sustained notes, when you go to play long notes, a lot of the time the noise gate set that hard will start to kill those notes. It's squishing them, so the quieter your note gets, that noise gate is just gonna stop it. Like, oh, you're done. Like this. Hear how the note just got quieter and quieter. It was still sort of there, but it's like, eh. Whereas if I take the noise gate off, it'll just continue to ring out. You get the idea. Also, if you're playing with an amplifier, you know, especially a cranked up amplifier, and you want to get like feedback and some of those cool raw noise sounds that are preferable that you want, you're not going to get that with a strong noise gate. So if you're going to use a noise gate, my point is be aware of how high you set the threshold, or when you have it on or off. You know, it's good when you need it, but you know, just be aware. All right, so now we've talked about the techniques that I use with my picking hand to try and control that extra noise, right? So let's move to the fret hand, and I'll show you a couple things there that when you use the two of these together, you're gonna really have a nice, clean distortion, if that makes sense. Now, a technique that I use a lot, that I don't see everybody do, but this is, you know, what I do, and this is, you know, my lesson series, so I'm gonna show it to you how I do it. Barring, you know, just like when you do bar chords, and you're holding your pointer finger, for example, across multiple strings, you have the control of having those strings ring out or sustain or not. If I let up, I'm still touching them, so they're muted, right? But when I hold them all down, see, and when I let up on them, they go away. So barring is a really powerful ally in cleaning it up on your fret hand. Here's an example. Notice how I was able to do that pentatonic run with very little interference from other strings or notes. And also, it kind of allows me to move faster. If I'm not constantly moving my pointer finger string to string and I can just bar it, it's kind of a double duty thing, isn't it? Like I'm able to move across the strings faster, assuming I have the same fretted root note. And also it's controlling all that extra noise. So there you go. A lot of string muting on your fret hand will come from barring, okay? Now, something else that you need to know is when you see me barring, this is a really hard thing to see or to show you, especially from a camera, but the bar, I might lift up or angle, especially when I get to the small strings, I might let up a little bit, so I'm only barring the first, you know, 3, 4, 5 strings or whatever. I've practiced enough to where I can kind of lift up just to hit the little E if I want to. You can get selective with it, but it does take a little practice. Point is, barring. It really helps to keep the noise down on your fret hand. Now, another example of muting with your fret hand is when your finger is leaning on a string, it's touching the string, not holding it down, but it's touching the string. And this happens a lot when we're playing octaves, right? So let's say I'm holding the 5 of the A with my pointer, and then I'm gonna go over to the 7 of the G. So I'm skipping over the D string. So as I play those two notes, which is the octave, right? Those are octaves of each other. Notice that if the D string is ringing out, it sounds weird, right? You hear that string ringing out and we don't want it. So if I use my pointer finger to lay down, not hold it down, but just lay down and touch that D string to mute it, like that, then I can play these octaves clean, because every time I'm strumming, I'm hitting the A and the G. I'm also hitting the D, but there's no note because the D is muted. So that's a super useful technique, I think, and very musical, because, you know, using octaves is always like a more full sound, but you don't always want that in between note. So there you go, you're welcome. The last thing we're going to talk about here is probably the most obvious in controlling the distortion beast, right? Taming the distortion beast. And that is turn your volume knob on your guitar, turn it down a little bit when you need to. Sometimes I think you want a lot of distortion, sometimes you want a little bit. Your guitar volume knob can give you a lot of that without having to tap a bunch of pedals, right? So if I'm playing a really intense part and I want a bunch of gain, notice how in the second part, I turned my volume down a little bit so I could get a little bit more staccato, a little more cut out of each note, right? I didn't want them to run together as much. So controlling your volume knob up and down gives you a lot of, well, just that. It gives you a lot of control. Okay, now this is gonna be the last thing I'm gonna leave you with today, okay? When you're practicing with your distortion, often when we use a ton of distortion, we use it to mask our mistakes, right? When you're playing with a bunch of hiss and fuzz, it covers up all our mistakes. So am I suggesting that you practice with a clean tone? Sort of, but here's the thing. When you go to the other end of the spectrum and you practice with a clean tone, the clean tone is a lot more quiet and subdued, so you're not going to hear all the mistakes. Some of them might be too quiet to hear, right? Because the clean tone isn't pushing them forward in a loud manner. So what I suggest is using a minimal or mid gain to practice your distortion licks. I'll give you an example here. This is what I call kind of like the AC/DC tone. See, it's like just a little bit of gain. It's still enough to practice distortion licks, but you're gonna hear every mistake I make because there's not enough distortion to cover it up, but at the same time, it's not quiet enough to where they'll go unnoticed. It's gonna push your mistakes to the front and show you all the holes in your Swiss cheese, I promise. So I suggest practicing that way. I still do it. I'll show you that barring lick that I did a minute ago, and that one is a real wake-up call for me when I'm off time with my picking especially. Check it out. See, already it's like, oh, that's a little different. It's still enough to practice a distortion lick, but yeah, I mean, clearly, my timing could be better. So that's why I use that sound. It kind of forces you to step it up, okay? But then when you're ready, when you get on stage and you want all the gain and all the distortion, just know how to control it, okay? Basically, just keep that dog on a leash. Sometimes you can let him out to run, but it's every now and then you just got to pull him back a little bit, okay? You get the idea. Hopefully this was useful to you guys. Stay heavy. I'll see you soon.